Principal shames black student, then learns his father is a Supreme Court judge. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in Riverside High School's main corridor as the afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Principal Margaret Stevens stood in her office doorway, her steel-gray hair pulled back in its usual severe bun, her posture rigid as she surveyed her domain. 23 years of maintaining order in educational institutions had taught her to spot trouble before it erupted, or so she believed. The sound of laughter echoing down the hallway drew her attention like a hawk spotting movement in a field. If you love your family, subscribe now and join us for more heartwarming moments. Through the stream of students moving between classes, she spotted a group gathered near the water fountain. At the center stood Jamal Thompson, his bright smile visible even from a distance as he gestured animatedly, surrounded by his friends who hung on his every word. Margaret's jaw tightened instinctively. She'd seen too many disruptions start this way, a crowd forming, voices rising, order threatening to dissolve into chaos. The bell had rung 2 minutes ago, and these students should have been moving to their next classes. Instead, they lingered, their laughter growing louder. Margaret watched as Jamal mimicked what appeared to be a dance move, his friends erupting in fresh peals of laughter. She noted how his uniform shirt had come partially untucked, how his tie hung slightly loose around his neck, small infractions that, in her mind, spoke to a larger pattern of disregard for authority. Without conscious thought, her feet began carrying her toward the group. Her heels clicked against the floor in a steady rhythm that had become synonymous with authority throughout the school's halls. She noticed how students along her path pressed themselves against the lockers, their conversations dying mid-sentence. The power of her presence was something she had cultivated carefully over the years, and she wielded it like a finely honed instrument. "Mr. Thompson," she called out, her voice cutting through the laughter like a blade. The group fell silent immediately, heads turning toward her approach. She saw the moment Jamal's smile faltered, watched as he straightened his posture instinctively. His friends began to disperse, moving away like leaves scattered by a sudden wind, but Margaret's focus remained fixed on Jamal. "Ma'am," he responded, his voice carefully neutral. She noticed how he subtly adjusted his tie, his fingers moving to tuck in his shirt, small gestures that, rather than appeasing her, only served to confirm her suspicions of his guilt. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" she asked, coming to a stop before him. The remaining students in the hallway slowed their pace, eyes darting between the principal and Jamal with poorly concealed interest. Margaret was aware of their attention, and it only strengthened her resolve. This was a moment to demonstrate that order would be maintained, that standards would not slip under her watch. Jamal's response came quickly, his voice steady despite the tension evident in his shoulders. "We were just talking about the talent show, Principal Stevens. Andre here was showing us his routine, and dash. I don't recall the hallway being designated as a performance space," she interrupted, her tone sharp. "Nor do I remember giving permission for students to be late to their classes because they were putting on impromptu shows." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Margaret watched as Jamal's expression shifted, the last traces of his earlier joy fading into something more guarded. Behind him, the few remaining friends who hadn't yet fled the scene exchanged uncomfortable glances. "It wasn't like that," Jamal began again, his voice softer now. "We were just dash." "I know exactly what this was," Margaret cut in, taking a step closer. She lowered her voice, but her words carried clearly to those still watching. This was a disruption. This was a blatant disregard for school rules and a poor example to set for other students. "I would have expected better from you, Mr. Thompson." She saw how her words landed, saw the flash of hurt in Jamal's eyes before he masked it. Around them, the hallway had grown unusually quiet, the normal between-class chaos suspended as students strained to hear the exchange. Margaret was acutely aware of her audience, of the necessity to maintain control, to demonstrate that no student, regardless of their academic standing or family background, was above the rules. "Report to my office immediately," she commanded, gesturing down the hallway. "We'll discuss this behavior in detail, and I'll be contacting your parents about this incident." Jamal's shoulders tensed, but his voice remained respectful as he replied, "Yes, ma'am." He adjusted his backpack, turning toward her office with a dignity that Margaret found somehow irritating. It wasn't the response she had expected, not the defiance she had been prepared to counter, nor the immediate contrition she had hoped to inspire. As Jamal began walking toward her office, Margaret turned to address the remaining spectators. "The rest of you need to get to class. Now." Her words sent the lingering students scurrying, their whispered conversations following them down the hallway. The walk to her office felt longer than usual, each step echoing in the now empty hallway. Margaret followed behind Jamal, watching his measured pace, the way he held himself straight despite the circumstances. Something about his composure unsettled her, though she couldn't quite identify why. She was used to students wilting under her authority, to seeing them physically demonstrate their understanding of their transgressions. As they approached her office, her assistant, Mrs. Rodriguez, looked up from her computer screen. Her dark eyes moved between Jamal and the principal, a slight furrow appearing between her brows. Margaret caught the look but chose to ignore it, gesturing for Jamal to take a seat in one of the chairs outside her inner office while she stopped to speak with Mrs. Rodriguez. "Pull Mr. Thompson's file for me," she instructed, her voice low but firm. "And hold my calls for the next 30 minutes. I'll need to contact his parents about this incident." Mrs. Rodriguez's hands moved to her keyboard, but she hesitated for a moment. "Principal Stevens," she began, her voice careful, "Jamal's and my nephew's AP Literature class. They're working on their final presentation together. He's never been dash." "The file, please, Mrs. Rodriguez," Margaret interrupted, her tone making it clear she wasn't interested in character references from her staff. She turned away, missing the way her assistant's lips pressed together in disapproval. Inside her office, Margaret took her time settling behind her desk, arranging her papers, adjusting her reading glasses. She let the silence stretch, a tactic she had found effective over the years. Through the glass partition, she could see Jamal sitting perfectly still, his eyes fixed straight ahead, hands folded in his lap. His continued composure only served to fuel her certainty that she was dealing with a practiced troublemaker, someone who had learned to maintain a facade of innocence. Finally, she called him in. Jamal entered and took the seat across from her desk, his movements deliberate and controlled. The afternoon sun streaming through the window behind her cast her shadow across him, a detail that seemed fitting to Margaret as she prepared to address his behavior. "Would you care to explain what I witnessed in the hallway?" she began, her voice stern but measured. She watched his face carefully, looking for signs of defiance or deception. "As I tried to explain, Principal Stevens," Jamal began, his voice steady, "we were discussing the upcoming talent show. Andre Wilson is performing a dance routine, and he was showing us a small part of it. We got excited because it was really good. I know we should have moved along faster after the bell, and I apologize for that." The explanation was reasonable, delivered without hesitation or apparent guile. Margaret found herself momentarily wrong-footed, but years of experience had taught her that the most disruptive students were often the most skilled at presenting plausible explanations for their behavior. "Mr. Thompson," she began, leaning forward slightly, "I've been an educator for over 2 decades. I've seen how small disruptions can escalate, how a moment of apparent harmless fun can lead to serious discipline problems. When I see a group of students gathering in the hallway, causing a disturbance dash." "We weren't causing a disturbance," Jamal interjected, a hint of frustration finally breaking through his careful composure. "We were just dash." "Do not interrupt me," Margaret snapped, her voice sharp. The words cracked through the air like a whip, and she saw Jamal flinch slightly before resuming his careful, neutral expression. "This is exactly the kind of disrespect I'm talking about. First, you disrupt the hallway, gathering a crowd and encouraging chaos. Then, when called to account for your actions, you attempt to justify them and speak over authority figures." She paused, watching as her words settled over him like a heavy blanket. Outside her office, she could hear Mrs. Rodriguez's telephone ringing, the muffled sound of her voice answering calls. The normal rhythm of school life continued beyond her door, but in here, time seemed suspended in the growing tension between them. "I'm going to contact your parents about this incident," she continued, reaching for her phone. This kind of behavior cannot go unaddressed. While your academic record may be satisfactory, character and discipline are equally important in this institution. For the first time, she saw real emotion flash across Jamal's face, not guilt or defiance as she had expected, but something that looked remarkably like resignation. It was an expression that seemed too old for his 17 years, and for a brief moment, Margaret felt a flicker of uncertainty. But she pushed it aside, reaching for the file Mrs. Rodriguez had placed on her desk, scanning for the contact information she needed. As Margaret flipped through Jamal's file, she found herself increasingly frustrated by what she saw. His academic record was exemplary, straight A's in AP courses, glowing comments from teachers, and even a letter of recommendation for a prestigious summer program at Yale. The lack of any previous disciplinary actions only strengthened her resolve. In her experience, students like this were often the most skilled at avoiding detection, their clean records a testament to their ability to manipulate the system rather than their genuine good behavior. The afternoon light shifted in her office as clouds passed overhead, casting shifting shadows across her desk. She could feel Jamal's steady gaze on her as she deliberately took her time reviewing the documents, letting the silence stretch between them like a taut wire. Outside her office, the muffled sounds of the school day continued. Distant locker doors closing, the squeak of sneakers on polished floors, the faint echo of voices in the hallway. "I see you're involved in quite a few activities," she said finally, her tone carefully neutral. Student council, debate team, volunteer work at the Children's Hospital. She looked up at him over her reading glasses. "That's quite a full schedule. Perhaps too full, leaving you feeling like regular rules don't apply when you're between commitments." Jamal shifted slightly in his chair, his first sign of real discomfort since entering her office. "No, ma'am," he replied, his voice still steady despite the tension evident in his shoulders. "I manage my time well. My parents have always emphasized the importance of balance." Margaret's lips tightened at the mention of his parents. In her experience, parents who pushed their children into too many activities often created entitled students who believed they were above school regulations. She'd seen it countless times. Ambitious families using their children's achievements as social currency, while overlooking fundamental issues of discipline and respect. "Let's talk about respect, Mr. Thompson," she said, closing his file with a decisive motion. "When I saw you in that hallway surrounded by other students who should have been in class, what kind of example do you think you were setting? As someone in student council, shouldn't you be modeling better behavior?" The question hung in the air between them, and Margaret watched as Jamal carefully considered his response. She noted how his fingers gripped the armrests of his chair slightly tighter, how his jaw clenched momentarily before he spoke. "I understand your concern, Principal Stevens," he began, his words measured and careful. "But I honestly don't believe we were doing anything wrong. We were celebrating a friend's talent, supporting his courage in performing at the show. Isn't that also part of being a leader, encouraging others and building community?" The response was articulate, thoughtful, and precisely the kind of sophisticated deflection Margaret had expected. She'd encountered this before, students who knew exactly how to frame their misbehavior in terms of positive values, who could spin any situation to their advantage. The fact that Jamal could do it so smoothly only confirmed her suspicions. "Building community," she repeated, letting a hint of skepticism color her tone. "Is that what you call creating a disruption in the hallway? Drawing a crowd that blocks other students' passage? Encouraging loud behavior that interrupts classes in session?" She stood up from her desk, moving to the window behind her. The afternoon sun had emerged fully from behind the clouds now, casting long shadows across the school's carefully maintained grounds. Below, she could see students in physical education class running laps around the track, their movements orderly and structured, exactly as school activities should be. "You know, Mr. Thompson," she continued, turning back to face him, "I've been an educator for a very long time. I've seen how situations like this can escalate. Today it's a group of students blocking the hallway, tomorrow it's a larger crowd getting out of hand. Small infractions lead to bigger ones when left unchecked." She watched as Jamal opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, seemingly thinking better of it. His self-control only served to irritate her further. In her experience, this kind of calculated restraint often masked a deeper defiance. "I'm particularly disappointed because you're in a position of influence," she pressed on. "Other students look up to you. When they see someone like you disregarding school rules, treating passing periods like social hours, what message does that send? How long before they start following your example, thinking they can turn our hallways into their personal entertainment venues?" Margaret returned to her seat, noting with growing irritation how Jamal maintained his composed demeanor. She had expected, perhaps even wanted, to see some crack in his facade, some sign that her words were having the intended impact. Instead, he sat there with a dignity that seemed to challenge her authority rather than submit to it. "Your record shows no previous disciplinary actions," she said, tapping his file with one manicured finger. "But sometimes that's more concerning than a history of minor infractions. It suggests a pattern of behavior that's gone unnoticed, unchecked." For the first time, she saw real surprise flash across Jamal's face. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice carefully controlled but with an edge of disbelief. "But are you suggesting that having a clean record is somehow evidence of misconduct?" The question hung in the air between them, and Margaret felt a flash of defensiveness. Put that way, her logic seemed flawed, but she knew what she had seen in the hallway. She knew the types of students who gathered crowds, who commanded attention, who pushed the boundaries of acceptable behavior. "What I'm suggesting, Mr. Thompson, is that sometimes students become very good at operating just on the edge of what's permissible. They learn exactly how far they can push before crossing a line that would get them into real trouble. They become adept at presenting one face to authority figures while leading other students in a different direction." She watched as something shifted in Jamal's expression, a subtle change that spoke of growing understanding, though not the kind she had intended to inspire. She saw him glance briefly at the family photos on her desk, at the teaching awards on her wall, as if seeing them, and her, in a new light. Mrs. Rodriguez's voice carried faintly through the door as she answered another phone call, the mundane sounds of school administration continuing beyond these four walls. But inside the office, the atmosphere had grown heavy with unspoken tensions and realizations. "Principal Stevens," Jamal began, his voice quieter now but with a new undercurrent of strength, "I think there might be some assumptions being made here that aren't fair. To me or to the other students who were with me." Margaret felt her spine stiffen at his words. "Assumptions? I saw what I saw, Mr. Thompson. A group of students causing a disruption, blocking the hallway, showing complete disregard for school rules and proper behavior. These aren't assumptions, these are facts. With all due respect," Jamal continued, and Margaret noted how carefully he chose his words, "what you saw was a group of friends supporting each other. Andre was nervous about his talent show performance. We were encouraging him, showing him that his art matters, that he has people who believe in him. If we were too loud or took too long to get to class, I apologize. But that was all it was." The explanation was reasonable, even touching in its simplicity. But Margaret had seen too many disciplinary issues start with similar justifications. She had worked too hard to maintain order in her school to let it be undermined by students who thought they could rewrite the rules to suit their purposes. "I think we're done here," she said finally, reaching for her phone. "I'll be calling your parents to discuss this incident. While you may not see the seriousness of your actions, perhaps they will help you understand why this kind of behavior cannot be tolerated." She began dialing the number from his file, watching as Jamal sat perfectly still, his expression now carefully blank. The phone rang once, twice, and Margaret prepared herself for what she expected would be a difficult but necessary conversation with parents who had likely enabled their son's behavior through excessive praise and insufficient discipline. What she didn't prepare for was the calm, authoritative voice that would answer her call, or how it would begin to unravel every assumption she had made in the past 30 minutes. The phone rang 3 times before a deep, measured voice answered. Judge Thompson speaking. Margaret felt her rehearsed speech falter momentarily. She had prepared herself for many scenarios, an overworked parent rushing through the call, an overly defensive mother, perhaps even an argumentative father. But the quiet authority in those 3 words caught her off guard. "Yes, hello," she began, unconsciously straightening in her chair despite being on the phone. "This is Principal Margaret Stevens from Riverside High School. I'm calling regarding your son, Jamal." Principal Stevens," Judge Thompson replied, his tone maintaining its professional calm.
"Is
everything all right with Jamal?" Margaret glanced at Jamal, who sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on a point just past her shoulder. She noticed for the first time how his tie, though slightly loosened, was tied in a perfect Windsor knot, how his shirt, despite being partially untucked earlier, was of better quality than most students wore. Small details she had overlooked in her initial assessment began to register with uncomfortable clarity. "Well, Judge Thompson," she continued, forcing herself back to the task at hand, "I'm calling because there was an incident today involving your son. I found it necessary to remove him from a situation where he was causing a disruption in the school hallway." "I see," came the measured response. "Could you please specify the nature of this disruption?" Margaret felt a subtle shift in the conversation's dynamic. Judge Thompson's question, though polite, carried the weight of someone accustomed to examining evidence and questioning assertions. She pressed on, determined to maintain control of the narrative. "Certainly. I observed Jamal with a group of students creating a disturbance between classes. They were being excessively loud, blocking the hallway, and preventing other students from moving to their next classes. When I attempted to address the situation, Jamal was less than cooperative." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Less than cooperative," Judge Thompson repeated, his tone neutral but somehow making the words sound like a cross-examination. "Could you elaborate on what you mean by that?" Margaret felt her confidence wavering slightly. "Well, when I confronted him about his behavior, he attempted to justify it rather than accepting responsibility. He seemed to show little regard for the authority of my position or the importance of maintaining order in the school environment." "I understand," Judge Thompson replied, his voice remaining steady. "And may I ask what specific school rules were violated during this incident?" The question caught Margaret off guard. She glanced down at the student handbook on her desk, its edges worn from years of reference. "Judge Thompson, surely you understand that maintaining discipline in a school environment requires addressing behavioral issues before they escalate into serious infractions." "Of course," he agreed smoothly. "Which is why I'm interested in understanding exactly what behavioral issues we're discussing. You mentioned a group of students. Was Jamal the only one called to your office?" Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I identified Jamal as the primary instigator of the situation. As a student leader, he should be setting a better example." "I see," Judge Thompson said again, but this time the two simple words carried a weight that made Margaret shift uncomfortably in her chair. "And what led you to identify my son specifically as the instigator?" The question hung in the air like a suspended verdict. Margaret found herself struggling to articulate the certainty she had felt in the hallway. "He was at the center of the group," she began, hearing how inadequate the explanation sounded even as she spoke. "The other students were responding to his actions, his behavior." "Principal Stevens," Judge Thompson's voice took on a more focused tone, one she imagined he used in his courtroom, "I'd like to make sure I understand the sequence of events clearly. You observed my son, who has no prior disciplinary record and holds several leadership positions in your school, laughing with his friends between classes. You immediately assumed he was the source of what you perceived as a problem, pulled him aside in front of his peers, and then brought him to your office for punishment. Is that an accurate summary?" Margaret felt the carefully constructed narrative she had built beginning to unravel. Put in those terms, her actions seemed hasty, her conclusions rushed. She glanced at Jamal again, seeing him now through a different lens. His continued composure no longer seemed like calculated defiance, but rather the practiced dignity of someone who had faced similar situations before. "Judge Thompson," she attempted to regain her footing, "I appreciate your concern, but I want to assure you that I have considerable experience in handling disciplinary matters. When I see a situation that could potentially disrupt the learning environment Principal Stevens," he interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind, "I don't doubt your experience. However, I am concerned about the assumptions that seem to have guided your decisions today. My son tells me they were discussing a friend's upcoming talent show performance. Was this verified with the other students present? Margaret felt her throat tighten.
No, y.
I didn't feel it was necessary to dash. I see, Judge Thompson said for the third time, but now the words carried a different weight entirely. Principal Stevens, I would like to come to the school to discuss this matter in person. I think it's important that we have a more thorough conversation about today's events and their implications. Would that be possible? The request was framed politely, but Margaret recognized it for what it was. Not a suggestion, but a statement of intent. She found herself responding automatically. Of course, Judge Thompson. When would be convenient for you? I can be there in 20 minutes, he replied promptly, and Margaret realized he had likely already been planning this even as their conversation began. Please ensure Jamal remains present. I believe his perspective will be valuable to our discussion. The line went quiet, and Margaret slowly placed the phone back in its cradle. The office seemed suddenly smaller, the afternoon sun that had earlier felt warm and authoritative now feeling harsh and exposing. She looked at Jamal, who had remained silent throughout the entire call, and saw something in his expression she hadn't noticed before. Not defiance or disrespect, but a quiet, weary knowledge. Your father will be here shortly, she said, trying to keep her voice professional despite the growing unease in her stomach. You may wait outside my office until he arrives. Jamal nodded once and stood, his movements still carrying that same careful dignity. As he reached the door, he paused for a moment, turning back slightly. Principal Stevens, he said softly, I really was just supporting my friend. Then he was gone, leaving Margaret alone with thoughts that were becoming increasingly uncomfortable. She looked down at his file again, still open on her desk. The stack of achievements and commendations seemed to mock her now. Outside, she could hear Mrs. Rodriguez speaking quietly to Jamal, her tone gentle and familiar. Margaret realized she had never heard that warmth in her assistant's voice when speaking to her. 20 minutes. In 20 minutes, she would face Judge Thompson in person, and somehow she knew that conversation would force her to confront things about herself she had long chosen to ignore. The ticking of the clock on her wall seemed louder now, each second bringing her closer to a reckoning she hadn't anticipated when she'd first spotted that group of laughing students in the hallway. The 20 minutes passed both too quickly and with excruciating slowness. Margaret used the time to straighten her already immaculate desk, adjust her blazer, and attempt to gather her thoughts. Each time she rehearsed what she would say, her usual confidence felt more like a thin veneer over growing uncertainty. The sound of voices in the outer office made her look up sharply. Through the glass partition, she saw a tall man in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit speaking quietly with Mrs. Rodriguez. Judge Thompson carried himself with the kind of authority that needed no announcement. It radiated from him like heat from a furnace. His presence seemed to fill the small office space, making it feel simultaneously larger and more confined. Margaret watched as he spoke briefly with Jamal, placing a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. The gesture was subtle but spoke volumes about their relationship, protective without being possessive, supportive without being smothering. She noticed how Jamal's shoulders relaxed slightly at his father's presence, though his carefully maintained composure never wavered. Mrs. Rodriguez approached her office door, knocking softly before opening it. Principal Stevens, Judge Thompson is here to see you. Her voice carried a note of formality Margaret had rarely heard from her usually casual assistant. Judge Thompson entered the office with measured steps, his presence immediately commanding the space. He was taller than Margaret had imagined from their phone conversation, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and a bearing that spoke of both physical and intellectual discipline. His face was handsome, with precise features and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once, keen, observant, but not unkind. Principal Stevens, he said, extending his hand. His grip was firm but not aggressive, professional rather than challenging. Thank you for making time to meet with me on such short notice. Margaret gestured to the chairs in front of her desk, trying to maintain her role as the authority figure in this space. Of course, Judge Thompson. Please have a seat. Jamal, you may join us as well. Father and son sat down in perfect synchronization, their movements carrying the same inherent dignity. Margaret couldn't help but notice how Judge Thompson's suit, like his son's uniform, was perfectly pressed, how his tie, the deep burgundy of old money and established power, was knotted with the same precision as Jamal's. "Principal Stevens," Judge Thompson began, his voice carrying the same measured tone it had on the phone, "I appreciate you taking the time to discuss this situation. Before we begin, I want to ensure we're all working from the same set of facts. Would you mind walking me through exactly what you observed today?" The request was reasonable, professional, yet Margaret felt herself tense. Something about his phrasing, the same set of facts, reminded her that she was speaking to someone who dealt in evidence and testimony for a living. "As I mentioned on the phone," she began, forcing her voice to remain steady, "I observed a group of students creating a disturbance in the hallway after the bell had rung. Jamal was at the center of this group, encouraging loud behavior and preventing other students from passing through." Judge Thompson nodded thoughtfully, his expression neutral. "And what specific actions did you observe my son taking that led you to identify him as the primary cause of this disturbance?" Again, the question was posed professionally, without obvious challenge, but Margaret felt its weight. She glanced at Jamal, who sat quietly beside his father, his hands folded in his lap, his expression carefully blank. "Well," Margaret continued, aware of how her next words might sound, "he was the one the others were gathered around. He was performing some sort of demonstration that was causing the others to laugh loudly. As a student leader, his behavior was particularly concerning." "I see," Judge Thompson replied, using those same two words that had carried such weight during their phone conversation. "And did you investigate what this demonstration was about before taking disciplinary action?" Margaret shifted slightly in her chair. "I felt the immediate need was to restore order in the hallway. The specific content of the disruption was secondary to addressing the behavioral issue." Judge Thompson leaned forward slightly, his movements deliberate and controlled. "Principal Stevens, are you aware that the demonstration you observed was actually a group of students supporting their friend Andre Wilson, who was nervous about his upcoming talent show performance?" Jamal mentioned something to that effect. Margaret acknowledged, her discomfort growing. "But the issue remains that they were creating a disruption dash." "If I may," Judge Thompson interrupted smoothly, "I'd like to explore what constitutes a disruption in your view. From what I understand, these students were using their passing period to offer encouragement to a peer. They were engaging in exactly the kind of supportive behavior we often say we want to see from our young people. Yet you immediately interpreted this as problematic. I'm curious about what led you to that conclusion." The question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to wave away. Margaret found herself struggling to articulate the certainty she had felt in the hallway. "Judge Thompson, in my experience, when groups of students gather in that way, it often leads to more serious disciplinary issues. As an administrator, it's my responsibility to maintain order dash." "Order," Judge Thompson repeated thoughtfully. An interesting choice of word. "Would you say you apply these standards of order equally to all student gatherings? For instance, how do you respond when the cheerleaders practice their routines in the hallway before pep rallies? Or when the debate team celebrates a victory between classes?" Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks as she recognized the trap in his careful questioning. Those situations had never struck her as problematic, had never triggered the same instinctive response she'd had today. She glanced at Jamal again, seeing now how her quick judgments might have been influenced by factors she didn't want to acknowledge. "My role as principal," she began carefully, "requires me to make quick decisions about situations that could potentially disrupt the school environment. While I understand your concerns, I hope you can appreciate the challenges of maintaining discipline in a large high school." Judge Thompson's expression remained neutral, but his eyes took on a more focused intensity. "I understand the challenges of your position quite well, Principal Stevens. Just as I understand the challenges my son faces every day in navigating spaces where his actions are often interpreted through a different lens than those of his peers. Would you say this is the first time you've made assumptions about Jamal's behavior based on, let's say, factors other than his actual conduct?" The question was posed with perfect professional courtesy, but its implications were impossible to ignore. Margaret felt the carefully constructed justifications for her actions beginning to crumble under the weight of Judge Thompson's precise questioning and his son's dignified silence. Outside her office, the afternoon sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across her desk. The familiar space suddenly felt foreign, as if she were seeing it, and herself, through new eyes. The teaching awards on her wall, the family photos on her desk, the carefully maintained order of her office, all seemed to take on a different meaning in light of the conversation unfolding before her. Judge Thompson shifted slightly in his chair, his movement deliberate and measured. The late afternoon light cast shadows across his face, highlighting the gravity of his expression. "Principal Stevens," he began, his voice taking on a different tone, not the measured professionalism of before, but something more personal. "Let me share something with you. When I was Jamal's age, I had a similar experience. I was captain of the debate team, maintained straight A's, and yet I found myself frequently called to the principal's office for what were termed behavioral issues." He paused, his eyes meeting Margaret's with an intensity that made her want to look away, though she forced herself to maintain eye contact. "One day, much like today, I was gathered with friends between classes. We were celebrating because I'd just been accepted to Yale. The celebration lasted perhaps 2 minutes longer than it should have. The principal at the time saw a group of students, saw me, and made immediate assumptions about what was happening. Do you know what he said to me?" Margaret remained silent, aware that the question was rhetorical. Beside his father, Jamal sat perfectly still, but she could see that he was listening intently, perhaps hearing this story for the first time himself. He said, "Mr. Thompson, I would have expected someone of your background to know better than to cause trouble." Those words stayed with me through law school, through my early years as an attorney, through my appointment to the bench. They stay with me now, watching my son navigate the same prejudices, wrapped in different words, but carrying the same weight. The silence that followed his words was heavy with meaning. Margaret found herself looking at the family photos on her desk, her own children now grown, their achievements proudly displayed. She tried to imagine them facing the same scrutiny, the same automatic assumptions, and felt something twist uncomfortably in her chest. "Judge Thompson," she began, but he raised his hand slightly, a gesture both polite and firm. "Please let me finish. When I received your call today, I heard in your voice the same certainty I'd heard in my principal's voice years ago. The absolute conviction that you knew exactly what you were seeing, without the need for further investigation or context. That certainty, Principal Stevens, is what brings me here today." He leaned forward slightly, his presence somehow filling more of the space without any obvious change in his posture. "You see, when you called to tell me about my son's disruption, I was in the middle of reviewing a case. A young man, bright and promising like Jamal, who had been repeatedly disciplined at school for behavioral issues. Small incidents at first, much like this one. But each incident added to a file, built a narrative, created a pattern that eventually led to more severe consequences. By the time his case reached my courtroom, that pattern had helped shape a future very different from the one his potential warranted." Margaret felt her throat tighten. She looked at Jamal, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time since he'd entered her office. She saw now what she had missed before, the weight of expectations he carried, the careful way he held himself, the constant awareness of being watched, judged, assessed. "I don't mean to suggest," she started, but Judge Thompson continued, his voice gentle but unwavering. "I know you don't mean to suggest anything explicitly, Principal Stevens. That's part of the problem. These suggestions, these assumptions, they often operate below the surface of our conscious thoughts. They influence our perceptions, our reactions, our decisions, while we maintain the belief that we're being completely objective." He turned slightly toward his son, his expression softening. "Jamal, would you like to share your perspective on what happened today?" For the first time since entering the office, Jamal's carefully maintained composure shifted slightly. He straightened in his chair, his eyes meeting his father's briefly before turning to face Margaret. When he spoke, his voice was clear and steady, but carried an undercurrent of emotion that made his words all the more powerful. "Principal Stevens, when you saw us in the hallway, You didn't see what was actually happening. You didn't see Andre, who's been practicing his dance routine for weeks but was ready to quit because he thought people would laugh at him. You didn't see how we were trying to show him that his art matters, that he has friends who support him. You saw what you expected to see: trouble, disruption, disorder. He paused, collecting his thoughts. Margaret noticed how his hands, still folded in his lap, tightened slightly before continuing. This isn't the first time. When I joined Student T Council, I heard whispers about how I was chosen to fill a quota. When I got the highest score on the AP Physics exam, a teacher suggested someone should verify the results. Every day, I have to prove that I belong in the spaces I've earned the right to occupy. The words hung in the air, their truth undeniable. Margaret felt something shift inside her, a crack in the foundation of certainties she'd built over her career. She remembered how quickly she dismissed Mrs. Rodriguez's attempt to speak about Jamal's character, how easily she discounted his explanation in favor of her own assumptions. Judge Thompson's voice broke the silence that had fallen. "Principal Stevens, I want you to understand something. When I was appointed to the bench, I made a promise to myself that my son would not have to fight the same battles I did. That he would not have to constantly prove his right to exist in spaces where his mere presence might make others uncomfortable. But sitting here today, listening to this conversation, I realized that promise may have been naive." He reached into his suit jacket and withdrew a small notebook, placing it carefully on her desk. "These are statistics from our district's disciplinary actions over the past 5 years. The patterns they reveal are troubling. Students of color, particularly young black men like my son, are 3 times more likely to be disciplined for disruptive behavior. They are twice as likely to be sent to the principal's office for attitude problems. Their explanations are less likely to be believed, their actions more likely to be interpreted as threatening or problematic." Margaret stared at the notebook, its presence on her desk like a physical manifestation of truths she had avoided confronting. She thought about how quickly she had jumped to conclusions in the hallway, how easily she had dismissed alternative explanations, how readily she had assumed the worst about a student whose record showed nothing but excellence. "I'm not here to condemn you, Principal Stevens," Judge Thompson continued, his tone softening slightly. "I'm here because what happened today is part of a larger pattern, one that has the power to shape young lives in ways we might not intend, but must take responsibility for. The question now is, what are you going to do with this understanding?" After Judge Thompson and Jamal left her office, Margaret remained seated at her desk long after the final bell had rung. The school had grown quiet, with only the distant sound of custodial staff and the occasional echo of closing doors breaking the silence. The notebook Judge Thompson had left still lay on her desk, its presence both an accusation and an invitation to change. She opened it slowly, her hands slightly unsteady. The statistics were laid out in neat rows and columns, their implications impossible to ignore. Each number represented a student, a moment of judgment, a decision that had shaped young lives in ways she was only now beginning to fully comprehend. Her eyes caught on specific entries: behavioral infractions by demographic, disciplinary actions by race and gender, pattern of office referrals. The data told a story she had been part of without acknowledging her role in its telling. Margaret stood and walked to her office window, watching as the last few students crossed the parking lot. A group caught her attention, diverse faces laughing together, supporting each other, their natural camaraderie a stark contrast to the divisions reflected in the numbers behind her. She thought about how differently she might have interpreted their gathering just hours ago, how quickly she might have moved to disperse them, to restore what she had always considered order. The weight of Judge Thompson's words pressed against her consciousness. She remembered his story about his own high school experience, the parallel he had drawn to Jamal's situation. The years between father and son stretched like a bridge built of similar moments, similar assumptions, similar struggles. How many times, she wondered, had she been the one constructing barriers rather than building bridges? She returned to her desk and opened her computer, her fingers hovering over the keyboard before she began to type. Implicit bias in educational settings, she entered into the search bar. The results filled her screen: academic studies, personal accounts, training resources. She began reading, each article leading her deeper into an understanding she had previously resisted. One account particularly caught her attention, a student describing the constant awareness of being watched, the exhausting need to carefully calculate every action, every word, every expression. It reminded her of Jamal's careful composure, the measured way he had held himself in her office. What she had interpreted as calculation had been survival, a learned response to a world that too often assumed the worst. Margaret opened her email and began composing a message to her staff, then stopped. No, this wasn't something that could be addressed with a simple memo or a hastily arranged training session. This required deeper reflection, genuine commitment to change. She reached for a legal pad and began making notes. Review disciplinary policies and procedures. Analyze patterns in office referrals. Establish clear, objective criteria for interventions. Create space for student voices and experiences. Each point led to more questions, more areas that needed examination. How many other students had she failed to truly see? How many times had her quick judgments altered the trajectory of young lives? The setting sun cast long shadows across her office, turning the familiar space into something different, something that demanded new perspective. She thought about Mrs. Rodriguez's attempted intervention earlier that day, how quickly she had dismissed her assistant's insights. How many other voices had she silenced in her certainty about what constituted proper behavior, acceptable expression, appropriate conduct? Margaret pulled up Jamal's file again on her computer, but this time she read it differently. His academic achievements, his extracurricular activities, his letters of recommendation, they weren't just accomplishments now, but testimony to a strength she had failed to recognize. Each success represented not just talent and dedication, but resilience in the face of constant scrutiny and assumption. She thought about the talent show mentioned earlier, about Andre Wilson's dance routine that had sparked the hallway gathering. How many other moments of joy, of support, of community had she interrupted over the years? How many times had she labeled celebration as disruption, friendship as disorder, solidarity as defiance? The phone on her desk rang, startling her from her thoughts. It was her daughter calling, probably their usual evening check-in. Margaret stared at the flashing light for a moment before answering, suddenly seeing these daily conversations in a new light. How easily she accepted her own child's explanations, how readily she celebrated her daughter's successes, how quickly she defended her against any perceived unfairness. "Mom," her daughter's voice came through the speaker. "Are you still at school? It's getting late." "Yes," Margaret replied, her voice slightly rough with emotion. "I've been thinking about some things, learning some things." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Is everything okay?" Margaret considered the question. Nothing was okay, really, not in the way she had previously defined it. But perhaps that wasn't a bad thing. Perhaps this discomfort, this questioning, was necessary for real change. "I had a meeting today," she began slowly, "that made me realize I need to look at things differently, to see things I've been avoiding seeing." After finishing the call, Margaret turned back to her computer. She began researching professional development programs focused on equity and inclusion, looking for resources that went beyond surface-level diversity training. She needed to understand the deeper structures, the implicit systems that had shaped her own perceptions and decisions. The custodian's vacuum cleaner hummed in the hallway outside her office, a familiar sound that had often signaled the end of her workday. But tonight, Margaret stayed, reading account after account from students and educators who had confronted these same issues. She found herself taking notes, not just of facts and statistics, but of feelings and realizations. Assumption of guilt without evidence. Impact of constant surveillance. Burden of perpetual proof. Cost of maintained composure. Each phrase connected to moments from her career, instances where she had acted with certainty while missing the larger context, the human cost of her quick judgments. She remembered faces, names, situations where she had imposed her definition of order without considering what that order might be destroying. As night settled over the school, Margaret finally began gathering her things to leave. The notebook Judge Thompson had left still sat on her desk, She would study its contents more thoroughly tomorrow. For now, she had something else to do. Opening a new document, she began to write. Dear Jamal and Judge Thompson, I owe you both an apology, but more than that, I owe you my gratitude. Today's conversation has opened my eyes to patterns and prejudices I had not allowed myself to recognize. 3 weeks after her meeting with Judge Thompson and Jamal, Margaret stood in the school auditorium, watching the final rehearsal for the talent show. Andre Wilson moved across the stage with fluid grace, his dance routine a powerful blend of classical and contemporary styles. The same movements that had sparked joy in his friends that day in the hallway now commanded the attention of everyone in the room. In the front row, Jamal sat with several other student council members, all of them focused on their clipboards as they made notes about lighting cues and transitions. But Margaret noticed how they occasionally looked up to offer encouraging smiles and supportive gestures to the performers. She saw now what she had missed before, the subtle ways students built each other up, the importance of these small moments of connection and support. The changes in the school over the past weeks had started small but were growing steadily. The morning after her meeting with the Thompsons, Margaret had called an emergency staff meeting. She'd stood before her teachers, her voice steady despite her nerves, and shared what she had learned. She'd presented the statistics from Judge Thompson's notebook, but more importantly, she'd shared her own journey of recognition. We've been operating under assumptions we haven't examined, she told them. We've been confusing control with education, compliance with character. Today, we begin to change that. The initial resistance had been expected. Some teachers bristled at the suggestion that their disciplinary practices might be biased. Others worried that addressing these issues would somehow diminish their authority. But Margaret had been prepared, armed with data, research, and most importantly, a new perspective. She'd invited Judge Thompson back to speak to the faculty, not as an angry parent, but as a partner in education. His presentation had been powerful, weaving together personal experience, legal insight, and a vision for what education could be when freed from unconscious bias. The same precision that had dismantled Margaret's defenses now helped build a foundation for change. The new policies started with simple adjustments. Teachers were required to document specific behaviors rather than subjective interpretations. Disruptive was no longer an acceptable description without concrete examples. Attitude problems had to be replaced with detailed accounts of actual words and actions. More importantly, students were given space to explain their perspectives before any disciplinary decisions were made. Margaret had also initiated what she called hallway connections, designated areas where students could gather briefly between classes to support, encourage, and celebrate each other. These spaces, marked by colorful floor designs created by the art department, served as safe zones where community building was not just permitted but encouraged. Now, watching Andre rehearse, Margaret thought about how close they had come to losing this moment. If she had maintained her old approach, if she hadn't been forced to confront her biases, Andre might have withdrawn from the talent show. The joy he was expressing through dance might have been stifled by the same systems meant to support his growth. After rehearsal, Margaret made her way to the front of the auditorium where Jamal was gathering his notes. Their interactions had changed since that day in her office, not because either of them had forgotten what happened, but because they had both committed to moving forward with purpose. "The show's coming together beautifully," she said, genuinely impressed by the level of organization the student council had achieved. "Andre's performance is particularly powerful." Jamal nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "It's amazing what people can do when they feel supported," he replied, his words carrying weight beyond their immediate context. Margaret acknowledged the gentle reminder with a nod of her own. "Your father's speaking to the district board next week about implementing our new approach across all schools. Would you be willing to join the student panel we're putting together? Your perspective would be valuable." The request was genuine, part of her commitment to ensuring student voices were heard in decisions that affected their education. Jamal considered it for a moment before agreeing, and Margaret noticed how he no longer seemed to calculate every response quite so carefully in their interactions. Later that afternoon, Margaret sat in her office reviewing the weekly disciplinary reports, another change she had implemented. Each incident was now analyzed for patterns, not just in student behavior, but in staff responses. Mrs. Rodriguez had become an invaluable partner in this process, her insight into student dynamics helping to provide context that might otherwise have been missed. The numbers were already showing improvement. Disciplinary referrals had decreased by 30%, while positive incident reports, another new initiative, had increased significantly. Teachers were learning to recognize and document moments of student support, leadership, and community building, creating a more balanced picture of school life. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message from Judge Thompson. He had sent her an article about another school district implementing similar changes, along with a brief note. Progress comes from those willing to learn and lead. Keep going. The encouragement meant more than she would have expected 3 weeks ago. As she prepared to leave for the day, Margaret paused to look at the new addition to her office wall. Next to her teaching awards hung a simple frame containing the first draft of the letter she had written the night everything changed. She had kept it as a reminder of both how far she had come and how far there was still to go. The sound of laughter drifted in from the hallway, natural, unrestrained, and no longer causing her instinctive concern. Through her office window, she could see a group of students gathered in one of the new connection zones, their animated conversation punctuated by supportive gestures and encouraging words. Tomorrow would bring the talent show, where Andre would dance and his friends would cheer without fear of reprimand. Next week would bring the district board meeting, where the changes at Riverside High would be presented as a model for broader reform. But tonight, Margaret took a moment to appreciate the simple sound of students feeling free to be themselves in the school they called home. As she gathered her things to leave, she noticed a college acceptance letter on Mrs. Rodriguez's desk, Yale University, addressed to Andre Wilson. Margaret smiled, thinking about how many stories of success might have been lost under the old system. The path forward wasn't always clear, and there would undoubtedly be more moments of uncomfortable recognition and necessary change. But for now, she was grateful for the lessons she had learned from a father, a son, and a moment in the hallway that had changed everything.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.